Hi guys, welcome to this video on Act 1 from An Inspector Calls. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the next part of the scene in which the inspector questions Sheila around her involvement in Eva's life and around the contact that Sheila had with Eva that may have led to her suicide. Now through Sheila's story, we start to see a difference emerge between her and Mr. Birling. Sheila feels guilty for what she did. She accepts some responsibility for Eva Smith's suicide, and she seems genuinely horrified by the circumstances around Eva Smith's death. Now put this in comparison to Mr. Birling's initial reaction, and we see one character, Sheila, who cares, and one character, Birling, who just doesn't care. And in presenting the two characters in this way, Priestley establishes conflict between the old and the young. Sheila is taking on a much more forward-thinking attitude. She begins to understand that people in society need to think about others and take more responsibility over how their actions impact on others, whereas Mr. Birling is very much set in the old ways that we shouldn't care for each other, and that as long as our actions benefit us, it doesn't matter what the consequences are for others. Yeah, but before we start looking at the annotation, let's have a little listen to the rest of this act.
What business? What's happening?
I'm a police inspector, Miss Birling. This afternoon a young woman drank some disinfectant and after several hours of agony died tonight in the infirmary.
Oh, how horrible. Was it an accident?
She wanted to end her life. She felt she couldn't go on any longer.
Well, don't tell me that's because I discharged her from my employment nearly 2 years ago.
That might have started it.
Did you, Dad?
Yes. The girl had been causing trouble in the works. I was quite justified.
Yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing.
Oh.
Don't look like that, Sheila.
I'm sorry. It's just that I can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly, and I've been so happy tonight. Oh, I wish you hadn't told me. What was she like? Quite young?
24.
Pretty?
She wasn't pretty when I saw her today, but she had been pretty. Very pretty.
Now, that's enough of that.
And I don't really see that this inquiry gets you anywhere, Inspector. It's what happened to her since she left Mr. Birling's works that is important, and we can't help you there because we don't know.
You sure you don't know?
Are you suggesting now that one of them knows something about this girl?
Yes.
You didn't come here just to see me, then?
No.
Well, of course, if I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have called you officious and talked about reporting you. Well, you understand that, don't you, Inspector? Look, are you sure of your facts?
Some of them, yes.
Well, I can't think that they could be of any great consequence.
The girl is dead.
You talk as if we were responsible.
Just a minute, Sheila. Now, Inspector, perhaps you and I had better go and talk this over quietly together.
Why should you? He's finished with you. He says it's one of us now.
Well, I've never known an Eva Smith.
Neither have I.
Was that her name? Eva Smith?
Yes.
Never heard it before.
So where are you now, Inspector?
Where I was before, Mr. Croft. I told you that, like a lot of these young women, she'd used more than one name. She was still Eva Smith when Mr. Birling sacked her for wanting 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and 6. But after that she stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it. Can't blame her.
Do you know what happened to this girl after she left my works?
She was out of work for the next 2 months. Both her parents were dead, so she had no home to go back to. And she hadn't been able to save much from her wages. So that after 2 months, with no work, no money coming in, and living in lodgings with no relatives to help her, few friends, lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate.
It's a rotten shame.
There are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Birling. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father.
But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people.
I've had that notion myself from time to time. In fact, I thought that it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women, counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms.
Yes, I expect it would. But What happened to her then?
She had what seemed to her a wonderful stroke of luck. She was taken on in a shop, and a good shop, too. Millward's.
Millward's? Well, we go there. In fact, I was there this afternoon. She was lucky to get taken on at Millward's.
That's what she thought. And it happened that at the beginning of December that year there was a good deal of influenza about, and Millward suddenly found themselves short-handed. So that gave her her chance. It seemed she liked working there. It was a nice change from a factory. She was making a good, fresh start. You can imagine how she felt.
And then she got herself into trouble there, I suppose.
After about a couple of months, just when she felt she was settling down nicely, they told her she'd have to go.
Yeah, not doing her work properly.
There was nothing wrong with her work. A customer complained about her, and so she had to go.
When was this?
At the end of January last year.
What did this girl look like?
I'll show you a photograph of her, Miss Birling. Here.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Well, what's the matter with her?
She recognised her, didn't she?
Yes.
Why the devil do you want to go upsetting the child like that?
I didn't do it. She's upsetting herself.
Well, why?
That's something I have to find out.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll find out first.
Shall I go to her?
No, you leave this to me. Must have a word with my wife. Tell her what's happening. We were having a nice little family celebration this evening. And a nasty mess you've made of it, haven't you?
That's more or less what I was thinking earlier tonight, when I was in the infirmary, looking at what was left of Eva Smith. A nice little promising life there, I thought. And a nasty mess somebody's made of it.
I'd like to have a look at that photograph now, Inspector.
You heard what I said before, Mr. Croft. One line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise we'll all be talking at once and won't know where we are. If you've anything to tell me, you'll have an opportunity of doing it soon.
Look here, I've had enough of this.
I dare say.
I'm sorry, but you see, we were having a little party, and I've had a few drinks, including rather a lot of champagne, and I've got a headache. And as I'm only on the way here, I think I'd better turn in.
And I think you'd better stay here.
Why should I?
If you turn in, you might have to turn out again soon.
Getting a bit heavy-handed, aren't you, Inspector?
Possibly. But if you're easy with me, I'm easy with you.
After all, you know, we're respectable citizens and not criminals.
Sometimes there isn't as much difference as you think. Well, Miss Birling?
You knew it was me all the time, didn't you?
I had an idea it might be, from something the girl herself wrote.
I've told my father. He didn't seem to think it amounted to much. But I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse. Did it make much difference to her?
It was the last real steady job she had. When she lost it, for no reason that she could discover, she decided she might as well try another kind of life.
So I'm really responsible.
A good deal happened to her after that, but you're partly to blame. Just as your father is.
But what did Sheila do?
I went to the manager at Millward's and I told him that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them.
And why did you do that?
Because I was in a furious temper.
And what had this girl done to make you lose your temper?
Oh, when I was looking at myself in the mirror, I caught sight of her smiling at the assistant, and I was furious with her. I'd been in a bad temper anyhow.
And was it the girl's fault?
No, not really. Well, all right, Gerald, you needn't look at me like that. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too.
Well, I never said I hadn't.
Never mind about that. You can settle that between you afterwards. What happened, Miss Birling?
I'd gone in to try something on. It was an idea of my own. Mother had been against it, and so had the assistant, but I insisted. As soon as I tried it on, I knew they'd been right. It just didn't suit me at all. I looked silly. Well, this girl had brought the dress up from the workroom, and when the assistant, Miss Francis, had asked her something about it, this girl, to show us what she meant, held the dress up as if she was wearing it. And it just suited her. She was the right type for it, just as I was the wrong type. She was a very pretty girl, too. With big, dark eyes, and... that didn't make it any better. Well, when I tried the thing on and looked at myself and knew that it was all wrong, I caught sight of this girl smiling at Miss Frances as if to say, "Oh, doesn't she look awful?" And I was absolutely furious. I went to the manager and I told him that this girl had been very impertinent and that... how could I know what would happen afterwards? If she'd been some miserable, plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. But she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. I couldn't be sorry for her.
In fact, you might be said to have been jealous of her.
Yes, I suppose so.
And so you used the power you had, as a daughter of a good customer and also of a man well known in the town, to punish the girl, just because she made you feel like that.
But it didn't seem to be anything very terrible at the time. Don't you understand? And if I could help her now, I would.
Yes, but you can't. It's too late. She's dead.
My God. It's a bit thick when you come to think of it.
Oh, shut up, Eric! It's the only time I've ever done anything like that, and I'll never, never do it again to anybody. I've noticed them giving me a sort of look sometimes at Millwards. I noticed it even this afternoon. And I suppose some of them remember. Oh, why had this to happen?
That's what I asked myself tonight when I was looking at that dead girl. And then I said to myself, well, we'll try to understand why it had to happen. And that's why I'm here, and why I'm not going until I know all that happened. Eva Smith lost her job with Birling and Company because the strike failed and they were determined not to have another one. At last she found another job in a big shop and had to leave there because you were annoyed with yourself and passed the annoyance on to her. Now she had to try something else. So first she changed her name to Daisy Renton.
Daisy Renton?
Where is your father, Miss Birling? I'd like to have another word with him now, if that's all right.
Eric, take the inspector along to the drawing room. Well, Gerald?
Well, what, Sheila?
How did you come to know this Eva Smith?
I didn't.
Daisy Renton, then. It's the same thing.
Why should I have known her?
You gave yourself away as soon as he mentioned her other name.
All right. I knew her. Let's leave it at that.
We can't leave it at that.
Now listen, darling.
You not only knew her, but you knew her very well. Otherwise you wouldn't look so guilty about it. When did you first get to know her? Was it after she left Millwards? When she changed her name, as he said, and began to lead a different sort of life? Were you seeing her last spring and summer when you hardly came near me and said you were so busy? Were you? Oh, yes, of course you were.
I'm sorry, Sheila, but it was all over and done with last summer. I hadn't set eyes on the girl for at least 6 months. I don't come into this suicide business.
I thought I didn't half an hour ago.
You don't. Neither of us does. So, for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector.
About you and this girl?
Yes, we can keep it from him.
Oh, you fool, he knows! Of course he knows, and I'd hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet.
Well, Mr. Croft?
You see, Gerald?
Okay, so let's start looking at some of this annotation. And before we look at it in proper, I just want to make the point that by repeating details of the case, the inspector constantly reminds us, the audience, what happened, reminding us how horrific Eva Smith's death was. Now, I think that Priestley chooses to do this to develop our sympathy by really embedding all of these details, but also to add to the horror of the death and make us realise that she's died in a really, really awful way. So it starts with the inspector repeating the case, and Sheila responds with, "Oh, how horrible! Was it an accident?" So this is showing Sheila's genuine feeling, and I'd like you to compare this to Birling's initial reaction. He says, nothing to do with me, I can't give you any information. Sheila actually expresses genuine feeling. We then have some difference between Eric and Birling. Eric believes that Birling discharging her from his factory might have started the issues leading towards her suicide. Here, Eric's showing that he does see cause and effect. Birling then once more tries to justify firing Eva Smith by commenting on labour struggles. He says the girl had been causing trouble in the works, remembering again that this was a result of unfair pay. So once more linking with that Marxist idea of class struggle and controlling the means of production. And Gerald backs this up by saying, I know we'd have done the same thing, showing that Crofts Limited would also have fired anyone that was looking at unionising workers or campaigning for better pay, showing that people are all alike in the world of business. That no one at this time was considering their responsibility towards their staff in paying them a decent wage. Sheila then uses some really emotive language to describe her reaction to Eva Smith's suicide. She describes how she just can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly. By using this violent word, Sheila is once more showing her sympathy towards Eva Smith and trying to make the audience feel sympathy for Eva Smith. We then see a little evidence of Sheila's attitude towards life before this interrogation from the inspector, where she says, "Oh, I wish you hadn't told me," showing that she wants to return to the sheltered life that she was living before she became aware of Eva Smith and her death. Now you could see this as her wanting to remain in the bubble that she's currently living in, unaware of how her actions are impacting those around her. But that's all going to change as the interrogation continues. We then see some facts comparing Eva Smith to Sheila. Their age, for example, they're both early 20s. She's 24. They're both described as pretty. The inspector describes Eva as very pretty. So this is like Sheila, foreshadowing details linking Sheila to involvement in her suicide. We then get a little foreshadowing that all the characters in the play played a part in Eva's suicide, as the inspector looks from Gerald to Eric to Sheila. This is just a little bit of implication through the stage directions. The idea then that Sheila is moving away from Birling and starting to develop this idea of social responsibility is explored where she says, "You talk as if we were responsible." And there is some dramatic irony within this statement because, the inspector is there to inspect them, therefore they must be responsible. We as the audience can understand that each character must have had something to do with Eva's death, otherwise the inspector wouldn't have been there at all. Birling shows his direct opposition to this sentiment, asking the inspector if he can take him into a back room to talk this over quietly in a corner. Now this shows that Birling is looking to control the situation, that he's looking to potentially manipulate the inspector using his patriarchal connections, as a magistrate and a friend to the police. Ultimately though, this shows that he is trying to protect his family. Birling's main concern is to protect his family, keep their names away from scandals so they can all achieve, the things that he wants them to achieve. Interestingly though, this could also be an attempt at a bribe. He wants to go to a quiet corner where he can possibly pay off the inspector and get him to be on his way. The inspector then once more recaps Birling's involvement with Eva's suicide. He also makes the point that she'd used more than one name. We'll see that across the play, her name does change. And he indicates that Eva possibly wanted to make some sort of change within her life. He says perhaps she'd had enough of it. Now Eric, in the same way that Sheila does, is developing away from the Birlings. And he replies with, "Can't blame her." This shows that Eric sees that her life wasn't good. It also shows that Eric has a certain amount of sympathy towards Eva Smith. Now, this again will become ironic towards the end of the play as we finally see Eric's involvement with Eva, but we'll discuss that when we get there. Sheila further develops her movement away from Birling by saying that she thinks it was a mean thing to do, as in firing Eva, again showing difference to Birling. The inspector now tries to build the tragic details of Eva's life, and we get some information about her life before she started working for Birling, and some information about her life in between being fired from Birling and her encounter with Sheila. The inspector indicates that both her parents were dead. That is incredibly tragic. He talks about how she's not able to save much money, that she was, paid to the point where she was living hand to mouth. Any money she got went on rent, food, bills. He talks about how she had no work, no money coming in, and that she was living in lodgings. All of this creates Eva Smith as a member of the underclass. She is now kind of dipping below the working class. And it's important to note that, even in society today, if you think of anyone that we would consider as underclass, sort of homeless people. You could possibly argue that these people have no stake in life. Life has treated them unfairly, and so what do they have to show for their lives? At the same time, she has no one to support her. She has no family. At the same time, she has no regular structure to her life because she has no job. And the inspector builds on this idea of her tragic life through this list of very short to the point statements about her. He says that she had few friends, lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate. Sheila here shows her sympathy by saying, it's a rotten shame. We now see the inspector introducing one of the bigger ideas within this play, the idea that Eva Smith represents a whole generation of people living in England at this time. He says there are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, showing that she represents a lot of people. Now, it's important to understand that Inspector Gould is seen as the voice of Priestley. J.B. Priestley wrote in this character so he could express his own opinions about society, and those opinions were socialist. Now, by saying that Eva Smith represents a lot of people that are living below the breadline, that need help from the government, that need help from everybody in society, the inspector is discussing an inherently socialist idea. This idea that society is bigger than the individual, and if everyone in society were to pull together and help each other, then overall we would all live better lives. The inspector then throws back some of Birling's own words at him. He says that if there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. And this is what Birling has said previously in the play. He talks about higher prices and lower costs. Well, one of the consequences of lower costs is people get paid less. Sheila replies, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Linking with that socialist idea, showing that she is changing, that she is learning from this story, before she's even seen what her involvement with it is really. The inspector then talks about a thought exercise in which we try to put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms, showing that he has empathy with Eva Smith and people that are in her situation, showing that he wants us to look at wider society rather than just looking at our families or our immediate business connections. The inspector then moves the story on, introducing Sheila's involvement in this case, saying that she was taken on in a shop, which is, when you think about it, another working class profession. She hasn't improved her station in life. In fact, she's actually devalued it. She's gone from being a skilled employee in a factory in which she was head of a team to just working a regular job in a clothes shop. We then get some details around the role of women. Sheila says, Millwoods, we go there in fact. I was there this afternoon for your benefit, talking to Gerald. This recalls the conversation that Gerald and Eric and Birling had at the beginning of the play, in which Gerald indicated that clothing was important to women, important to their self-esteem. Now, by Sheila saying that she was there for his benefit, for Gerald's benefit, shows that she sees clothes as important to men's self-esteem, that it's important to Gerald that she wears nice clothes. But given the choice, she may have worn something completely different. So structurally here, the inspector is using short sentences, showing that he's getting to the point, and he talks very much like a detective would talk, most of the time just giving hard facts, and then every now and again injecting emotion into what he says. The inspector then indicates that Eva was happy with this change in her life, even though it meant a move down from a skilled profession she was good at. He says that she felt she was making a good, fresh start, the idea that her life had got back on track. However, all this would come crashing down when Millwoods would let her go. Now, what does this say about workers' rights? She didn't have a fair dismissal. There were no previous warnings. There was no union involvement helping to protect her from, predatory bosses. She was just let go. She was just fired for a reason that she's given, but it's not really gone into and it's not really explored. Birling hit again, siding with business. His first thought, not doing her work properly. So his first thought is that, she must have done something wrong to have meant that Millwoods would fire her. The managers are always in the right. The inspector then says that a customer complained about her and so she had to go. A customer that was in the shop had made a complaint about Eva Smith and so she was fired. Now this shows that in a capitalist society, the consumer holds all the power. If you want to make a complaint about someone or something, then you are the person in the right. It also shows that consumerism puts more value in the customer than in the staff. And I think very much in the times that we're living in now, you can see that, it doesn't matter that staff put themselves at risk as long as the customer and the customer's needs are satisfied. Now, all of this causes Sheila some disturbance, and we'll find out why. But look at the stage direction. It says staring at him agitated. This foreshadowing shows that she knows that she's connected to this, because she must obviously remember being in Millwoods making a complaint about someone that worked there. In the way that Sheila responds to the photo, we see some of her guilt. It says recognises it with a little cry, gives a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. So she leaves the scene. She's upset, distressed by seeing this picture. We then see Birling further trying to defend his family, because why the devil do you want to go upsetting the child like that? He's protecting them. At the same time, though, he is constantly infantilizing Sheila. He makes her seem younger than she actually is by using words like child. The inspector then says that she's upsetting herself. She's made herself upset. Birling asks, well, why? And the inspector says, I don't know yet. There's something I have to find out. Now, this could be read in two different ways. Thinking about why she's upsetting herself. It could be details of her involvement. The inspector is looking to find out exactly how much Sheila had a part to play in the suicide of Eva, and that is what is upsetting her. The idea that she was part of something that caused someone to kill themselves. At the same time, the thing the inspector could be trying to find out is whether or not she has a social conscience. This idea that Sheila is more caring of people in society than Birling and Mrs. Birling. And that is what is upsetting her, that her social conscience has been challenged and checked, and she realises that she's in the wrong. We then get more of Birling refusing to accept responsibility. He says, we're having a nice little family celebration tonight, and a nasty mess you've made of it now, haven't you? However, once more, as we've seen before in the play, the inspector flips Birling's words round onto him, and when talking about Eva in the infirmary, says, a nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. This parallelism, this using the grammatical structure of Birling's words to highlight the exact opposite point of view, shows the contrast between Birling and the inspector, but at the same time, it talks about class struggle. It talks about there being no room for manoeuvre on either side. Birling is not going to step down from his ideas, and the inspector is not going to step down from his ideas. It also shows Birling the complete stupidity of what he's saying. He is using rhetoric, and he's trying to persuade the inspector, but the inspector is basically saying, I recognise you're using this rhetoric, and your persuasion isn't going to work. Then, in response to Gerald asking to see the photo, the inspector indicates that he wants to work the case one line of inquiry at a time, showing he has a very calculated approach to the investigation, but at the same time showing that he wants each to feel the full force of his scrutiny. He doesn't want anyone to be able to collaborate with anybody else, or for anybody to sneak off and come up with kind of alternative stories or false information that means that they're going to wiggle out of their responsibility for the death of Eva Smith. At the same time, this shows the inspector has no care for Gerald's words, and much in the same way that he isn't intimidated by the status of Birling, he also isn't intimidated by the status of Gerald. Gerald then shows some worry for the stage direction rather uneasily. Well, I don't suppose I have. Eric then tries to explain everyone's nerves and everyone's kind of anxiety towards the situation. However, if you look at the way that he talks, he uses broken sentences, indicating that there is a struggle in him explaining these ideas. The inspector then really lays out the rules for these interrogations. Throughout this part where Sheila is out of the room, the inspector kind of outlines the structure for each of these interrogations and the structure for the whole play. Right back at the top of the page, the one line of inquiry at a time, and then further down he says, if you're easy with me, I'm easy with you. If you comply and you listen to what he has to say and you accept responsibility, then he won't make it any more difficult than it needs to be. We then get Gerald's view of himself and of the Birlings, since after all, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. Now, this is an interesting point to make, because your status doesn't mean you can't be a criminal. You could be the wealthiest, most upstanding person in the world, you can still commit a crime. And the inspector shows that he understands this when he says, sometimes there isn't as much difference as you think. Backing it up with the idea, I wouldn't know where to draw the line, showing that the inspector feels there really isn't a line you can draw where it becomes impossible for a person to become a criminal because of their status in society. I think this also shows that Gerald feels that he is protected by his status in society from any wrongdoing, and that no one will consider him a criminal because, he is a man of business. Sheila then returns, and we instantly see there is a massive difference between her and Birling. You think about Birling's reaction and Sheila's reaction. She says, I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse. So she knew what she did was wrong then, but now she feels even more guilt and regret. She asks, did it make much difference to her? The inspector says, yes, I'm afraid it did. It was the last real steady job that she had, and this is really the beginning of Eva's downfall. Note, the inspector doesn't pull any punches with Sheila. He just tells it like it is. He says that afterwards she decided she might as well try another kind of life. This is a euphemism for prostitution, showing again that Eva Smith is on the brink of entering, a true area of underclass society. Sheila here, this is a really important line. She asks, so I'm really responsible? And this is the first real admission of guilt in the whole play. She is saying that, I'm responsible for Eva Smith losing the job at Millwoods and entering into the profession that would eventually lead to her death. Compare this to Birling's speech, where he talks about if we were all responsible for everything, then everything would get in a mess. Sheila understands that she has some social responsibility towards this girl, whereas Birling feels that he isn't responsible for anyone ever, apart from himself and his family. We then see Sheila's rundown of what happened in the past, and this really is showing someone using their consumer power to get what they want, and in this case, ruin another person's life. She says that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again, and I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them. She's using the family's wealth to threaten the shop to get her own way. She says that she was in a furious temper, showing she was jealous of this girl who she thought was laughing at her for wearing a dress that really wasn't suitable for her, a dress that she didn't look very good in. Here we get that trivial statement. She caught sight of her smiling at the assistant, and I was furious with her. This shows that Sheila before now was, vindictive, mean, greedy, didn't care about the effect that her actions had on other people. However, that is changing, and we will see that change across the whole of the play. She says to Gerald then, I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too, foreshadowing Gerald's story, that he must have some involvement because he's there. We then have some ideas around jealousy, consumerism and vanity. Talking about the dress, she says that Eva Smith was the right type for it, just as I was the wrong type. Again, showing Sheila's backstory, she says that I was absolutely furious, I was very rude to both of them, showing her character before the inspector. How could I have known what would happen afterwards? Linking with that, showing that she had no thought towards the lives of others at that point. Before the events of this play, she had a lack of social conscience. We must always be considering how characters change across plays and texts, and Sheila's character is probably one of the most dramatic changes within this play. And then finally, we see that she does it despite Eva's beauty. Now, this very much is in contrast to the Eva that we're presented at the beginning of the play. The twisted, contorted, bleach-drinking, burnt face, all of that kind of stuff. This shows that Sheila's jealousy was rooted in Eva's beauty. And again, there is some irony within that when you consider Gerald's involvement with Eva. We'll get onto that in the next act. But, the fact that she was so pretty caused Sheila to be jealous. It's kind of the same reason that Gerald gets involved with her. Because she's so pretty, Gerald ends up kind of going out with her a little bit. So now the inspector sums up and says, so you used the power you had as a daughter of a good customer and also of a man well known in the town to punish the girl just because she made you feel like that. This shows a similarity between Sheila and Birling at this time. Birling uses capital to lever power against another. He uses her job to lever power against her to stop her demanding a raise. Sheila uses the same means against Eva. She uses the capital that she has over the shop, the money that she will spend in that shop, to get them to do what she wants. Sheila then says, but it didn't seem to be anything very terrible at the time, showing her pre-social conscience times. Think about as well, she's living in a capitalist bubble. She has her mum and her dad telling her about values and about how to live her life. This very much fits in with their values and the way that they live their lives. showing before the play that Birling and Mrs. Birling both have quite a lot of influence over Sheila. However, she is starting to change. She says, if I could help her now, I would. Now note, when talking about the Millwood staff after this encounter, she says that she'd noticed them giving me a sort of look sometimes at Millwoods. I noticed it this afternoon, and I suppose some of them remember. This talks about class struggle and conflict. The other workers at Millwoods know that Sheila Birling had Eva fired and are worried that potentially she's going to do it to them. Or it could just be, that they really dislike her now for having the nerve to insist that one of their colleagues be fired. Once more, we see Gould repeating the details of the case to highlight the injustice of the case, to try and affect the audience, but also to try and affect the characters. We then see the first mention of the name Daisy Renton. This was the name that Eva Smith changed her name to after being fired from Millwoods as she started to become a prostitute. Now look at Gerald's reaction, startled. What? This shows that Gerald is in some way linked with Daisy Renton. So then the inspector leaves, and we're left to see Gerald and Sheila, after the bombshell that Gerald has kind of knows Daisy Renton, have a final conversation before the end of the act. And as we approach this, we must start to consider, how are Sheila and Gerald different to the start of the play? How have their characters begun to change? And also, how is their relationship changing? If you remember right back at the beginning of the act, the thing with the wedding ring, oh, it's the one you wanted me to have. And Gerald talking about women wearing clothes and all this kind of stuff. How is their relationship starting to fracture? Gerald tries to deny that he knew Daisy Renton by saying, why should I have known her? Sheila replies with, oh, don't be stupid. We haven't much time. You gave yourself away as soon as he mentioned her other name. This shows that right now, Sheila actually has some control over Gerald. She's recognised a tell of his and understands that he very much knew Daisy Renton. This is a change within the power dynamic of their relationship. At the beginning of the play, Gerald had control over Sheila, whereas now Sheila has control over Gerald. Gerald tries to lie his way out of it with, now listen darling, but she interrupts him straight away, saying that's no use. She mentions that he looks guilty. Then we get a callback to that time mentioned at the beginning of the play when Gerald spent weeks away from Sheila. She says, were you seeing her last spring and summer during that time when you hardly came near me and said you were so busy? Remembering that Gerald was on business here. And she comes to the realisation, yes, of course you were. Now this again shows a change in Sheila's character. This shows her moving against the patriarchy, moving against the standard idea that women should submit themselves to men, because she will not submit herself to this man. She is going to hear what he did, and she's going to make sure that it all comes out because of that growing sense of responsibility within her and her desire to know the truth. Gerald continues to deny, I don't come into this suicide business. He doesn't feel any responsibility in the same way that Birling doesn't feel any responsibility. Gerald feels that he can keep it from him, feeling he can lie to the detective and stop any of this truth from coming out. Sheila, however, understands the situation fully and hysterically laughs. Why, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows. Sheila here sees how it will all play out. She's had her eyes opened the situation and understands that each one of them are responsible for Eva's death and must face some sort of consequence. This realization causes Sheila to look at him almost in triumph. She feels victorious over Gerald. She feels victorious over the family because she understands something that they don't. However, Gerald looks crushed. In this stage direction, there is quite sharp contrast. Gerald has seen Sheila giving her story, seen her interrogation, and now Sheila wants to see Gerald's. Look at the way that the scene ends. There will be some reference to this across the other acts. The door slowly opens and the inspector appears, looking steadily and searchingly at them. Now consider the symbolism of the inspector standing in the doorway in this way. This shows the inspector as a kind of gatekeeper. On one side of the door is freedom, on the other side, you are trapped in this room. On one side is justice, on the other side is the criminal. On one side is a family of individualists, on the other side is society at large. And the inspector stands between all of those things. He also blocks their escape. There's no getting away from it while the inspector is there. And Priestley ends the action with the question, well, which you'll see picked up right at the beginning of the next act. Now, as we're going across the play, I'd just like you to consider how each scene ends and the position of characters within the doorway. That symbolism remains, and we'll see various characters taking up that position, and we need to think a little bit about what that represents. Okay, so that's the end of Act 1, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye-bye.